about language decline, language death, and revival. And this is a subject I did some research on when I was doing an MA in linguistics in Bangor University in Wales. And I looked particularly at the Manx Gaelic language. Now, I know nobody here probably speaks Manx, which is not surprising, because there's only about 1,800 people in the world who speak it. But until about the 1980s, there were native speakers, and it's been revived since then. So I'll talk a bit about that, and I'll look at other languages that have been revived as well. So first, I'm going to define what is language death. What does it mean for a language to die? So languages, if parents stop passing on their language to their children, in technical linguistic terms, you say breakdown of intergenerational transfer, that language is called moribund. Now, according to some estimates, about half the languages in the world are moribund. Many languages, like Native American languages, they're only spoken by the elders of the tribe. Efforts are being made to revive them, but the kids aren't speaking them. If all the speakers have gone, nobody speaks the language anymore, then you can say it's dead. But if it's been documented, if people have made written records, recordings, then it's possible to revive it. If it was never written down, there's no remaining records, then it's gone. It's extinct. So there's different levels, and when revival efforts start, it depends what stage a language has got to. If there's no speakers left, but there's records, then it's possible to revive it. But otherwise, it's very difficult. So why do languages die? There are all sorts of reasons why languages can die. In many cases, there is repression from governments, from incoming people who move to a different area, like in the Americas, when settlers from Europe started arriving. Many of the Native American languages that were spoken at the time disappeared. It was partly because the Europeans brought diseases that the Native Americans had no resistance to. That wiped out about 90% of the people there. Also because English became the dominant language. And until the mid-20th century, many children of Native American heritage were taken away from their parents, educated in boarding schools, and forced to speak English. They were punished for speaking their native languages. And this had a profound effect on them, as you can imagine. In some cases, their mouths were actually washed out with soap and water if they spoke their native languages. There's many other cases around the world. In Wales, for example, there was the Welsh Not kind of punishment, where if children go to school, they speak only Welsh. Still, children today are like that. But at the time, all education was in English. So if the teacher heard the children speaking Welsh, they would put this piece of slate with a string around their neck, and you had WN on it, Welsh Not. At the end of the day, the child who had that slate, if another child was heard speaking Welsh, then it was passed on to the next child. At the end of the day, the child with the slate was beaten. This wasn't an official policy. It was implemented in some schools, and children who had this in school, when they grew up, they decided they didn't want their kids to go through this, so they didn't pass on Welsh to their kids. And there's many examples of this kind of treatment. So that's one way in which languages can disappear. There's a process of language shift that can also occur for all sorts of reasons. You can see in some countries, like in the Netherlands, in Scandinavia, many university courses are offered in English. They're also offered in the local languages as well. But if all higher education was in English, you could say that's a form of language shift. And then if English was adopted, say in the media, or TV and radio was in English, it's kind of English is taking over different areas where the local languages were formally spoken. So that's a process of language shift where things can take over, but the language remains in certain domains, in the family, in everyday conversation, in lower forms of education. So, and within speech communities, those are kind of external pressures. With internal pressures within speech communities, you have when a language is kind of disappearing and being marginalized, you might have people within that speech community who grow up without the language, and they come to decide it's not used anymore. It's not needed. There's no point in wasting your time learning this language. So why should anybody else spend money on it, supporting it? And then they become hostile to it, and they resist any efforts to promote it, to encourage people to speak it. You find that in Wales. There's about 3/4 of the people in Wales don't speak Welsh. Everybody has to learn it in school, but very few people will end up speaking it who have learnt it as a subject in school. If they go to a Welsh medium school, which are very popular, many English-speaking parents will send their kids to a Welsh medium school. Some kids will grow up, they'll speak it, they'll pass it on to their kids, but many don't. They only speak it in school. When they go home, they speak English with their parents, with their friends. So there are many different issues with minority languages particularly. This is a problem. And then, as in the Native American case, you have disease can wipe out populations. If a speech community is very small, then a natural disaster, disease, war, genocide, they can disappear very quickly. In places like New Guinea, where most speech communities are very small, 100 or 200 people maybe or less, if they live in traditional style lives, they stay in the same place all the time. Anybody they see who comes in their territory is a potential enemy. They might try and kill them. They might try and avoid them. This is something I found out from Jared Diamond's book, The World Until Yesterday, which is very interesting. It tells you about, well, it kind of compares people who live in that kind of society with westernized Western societies. And he says people who live in those societies tend to be polyglots. And it's not because they want to be like us, it's because they need to be, because they only have 50 or 100 people in their tribe. They need to talk to people around them, so they need to speak their languages. They don't go to school, they just listen and speak and learn what they need to speak. So it's normal for people to speak 4 or 5 languages in such communities, maybe 10, maybe 15. That's very common. But those communities are very vulnerable because they're so small. In larger populations, it takes longer for such influences to have an effect. But okay, another problem with minority languages is often they're spoken in rural areas. So when a bigger language comes in, often it takes over in the cities first. For example, in Wales, you had English coming in. There was English towns, and they brought English settlers and people from other places to settle in Wales. And Welsh people could go into these towns, but they're forbidden to speak Welsh. And they couldn't live in these towns. So these kind of created English islands within Wales. And people saw these places and they thought, to get ahead, you have to speak English. And many people still believe, that you can't have 2 languages in one head. We know that's ridiculous. You can have many more if you want. But many people still believe that. They worry that their kids, if they speak 2 languages, they get confused. They never speak either of them well, so they have to speak the dominant language. So married parents, even though they're fluent speakers of the minority language, they will not pass it on to their kids. So in that kind of situation, maybe the kids themselves will decide they don't want to learn the minority language. They'll see everybody else outside, all the TV and the films and the radio, and most people are speaking the majority language, so they think, what's the point? They'll maybe understand what their parents say, but they decide they don't want to speak it. I've seen that in many cases. Some of my friends have kids in Wales, and they speak Welsh to them all the time. The kids always speak English. Same in Ireland. I've seen that in Scotland. So that's a common problem. But yeah, I was kind of, I hadn't prepared kind of very detailed notes, as you can see. I'm doing this off the top of my head. So I go off on tangents, don't worry. Rural depopulation, that was what I was talking about. So if a language is only spoken in rural areas, if another language has come to dominate in cities, then people in those rural areas, if they want jobs, they want to go to higher education, they often move to the cities. And then they find themselves in a sea of the majority language. And some of them who are very stubborn, they will keep speaking their minority language. But most, perhaps, they won't. And maybe they'll settle in the cities, end up speaking the majority language only. So in rural areas, it's hard to find jobs. It's hard to the opportunities just aren't there, basically. In some places, the environment can be a problem. So in places where languages are particularly diverse, the environment is very diverse as well. Like in Brazil, there are many languages. You've got amazing environmental diversity. But if you've got big logging companies, big mining companies coming in, cutting down all the trees, then that has a major effect on the people who live there. They lose their land, they have to move, and maybe they lose their language as well. So why is this a problem? The major problem is the loss of culture and knowledge. You can say, some people say, oh yeah, in the rainforest there may be cures for cancer. We should preserve this environment because there may be cures for cancer. But you could also say people who live in these environments, they have knowledge of their local flora and fauna, which maybe is not known to Western science. So when their language goes, that knowledge goes if it hasn't been written down. And maybe it can be transferred to another language, but if no one's recorded it, when it's gone, it's gone. Every language is a different way of seeing the world. I mean, you can argue about whether language shapes thought or thought shapes language or whatever, but there are different ways of seeing the world, and every language, every culture has its own way of seeing the world. So when the language goes, that's another possibility gone. And for linguists, I studied linguistics. Linguistic diversity is important. If a language has a feature that no other language has, and it dies, then we might never know that feature existed. We might assume it's not possible. A particular sound, a particular way of ordering words, a particular conjugation or whatever. So for linguists, that is a great loss if languages disappear. And also psychological impacts. If you lose your language, imagine if you are the last speaker of a language. No one else speaks it. You've got no one to speak to. How would you feel? You would feel very lonely, probably. But if you've lost your language, and maybe people in your community still speak it, but you don't. Maybe your parents spoke it, but they chose not to speak it to you. Maybe you feel ashamed. You think you'd like to speak that language, but you can't. Maybe you feel, oh no, that language is no use anymore. It's no great loss. But if say your parents, your grandparents, they were punished in school for speaking the language, maybe they will kind of, that attitude will come down to you, and you will think, no, there's no use speaking that language. It will cause problems, and the loss of a language, it can make you feel, I don't know,
lost the microphone.
doesn't work anymore.
Hello? Can you? No. Okay, I'll just have to try and talk loudly. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So what's the scale of this problem? Well, we don't know how many languages there are in the world exactly. Various sources give different numbers, between about 5,000 and 7,000 is the agreed number. And more than half of them will be moribund. As I explained, that's no children are speaking them anymore. So many of them only have 1,000 or less speakers, and many of them only have less than 100 speakers. So some have even fewer. So the estimate, it varies. By the end of this century, there may only be half of the language still spoken left, or maybe even fewer. Maybe 90% will have gone. So UNESCO has a way of assessing the language levels of language risk. Okay. So number one, a language is safe. It's widely spoken in all domains. Children use it, used in media, in education, government, and everything. If it's vulnerable, not spoken by children outside the home. So you've got 600 languages which are used in that category. It's definitely endangered. Children not speaking it. So that's the moribund level, 646. Severely endangered, number 577. Critically endangered, 577. So these are numbers I found they're a bit out of date. I looked on the latest UNESCO site, and they listed 2,471 languages on their atlas of the world's languages in danger. So those are the ones they believe that might not survive until the end of the century. So, is that working? Yeah. Okay. So what can we do about this? You might say, language death and change is normal, it's natural. We can't do anything, it's just going to happen. Just let it go. So we do nothing. We could document the languages. We could write dictionaries and grammars and make recordings and videos. So if people want to revive them, they can. But if they don't, it's still there. We know about it. We can try to revive and revitalize them and maintain them. We can support the speakers financially, politically, and in other ways. Okay. So particularly I want to focus on revival. There are a number of languages that had lost all their native speakers but have been revived. The most famous example is Hebrew. It never died out completely. It was only used in limited domains. But by about the 2nd century AD, no one spoke it as their everyday language. They used it in the synagogues. Jews used it to talk to each other. If they come from different countries, they didn't share a common language, they'd use Hebrew. So it was used in that way for 1600 years. But then in 1882, a man called Eliezer ben Yehuda, he moved to Palestine, as it was then, and he decided to raise his child as the first native speaker of Hebrew in all that time. So he made Hebrew his home language. And it was hard, because until then, Hebrew had only been used to a limited extent. There was a lot of vocabulary he didn't know, everyday words. So he had to make them up, to find them, to use existing roots, to borrow from other languages. I think a lot of words borrowed from Yiddish, borrowed from English, and they adapted. And he encouraged other people to do the same. So a small community of Hebrew speakers grew up. And over time, there was various organizations set up to encourage people to speak Hebrew. And people spoke it in public, but they carried on speaking their whatever native language at home. And then there was an organization set up which kind of was kind of forcing people to speak Hebrew, really. You know, if they were heard to speak another language, they were publicly shamed, or they're fined, or in some ways they were kind of forced to speak Hebrew. But this policy worked. Now everybody pretty much in Israel speaks modern Israeli Hebrew. It's not the same as biblical Hebrew, but it's a living language. That's the most successful example of a revived language. And all the immigrants to Israel, they are given Hebrew lessons. There's a kind of movement called Ulpan, which has been copied for other languages. And they're given lessons and they learn, but they find it hard. Because we know it's not easy to learn a language, especially if you're an adult, you're busy, you have family, you have work. Finding the time, and if you're not a language geek, a polyglot, it's maybe not your top priority. You learn enough to get by. But the kids, they will be native speakers. So another example of a revived language is Cornish. This is a Celtic language related to Welsh. It was spoken in Cornwall in the southwest of Britain. It's a little bit at the bottom. And officially the last native speaker died in 1777, I think it was. She was called Dolly Pentraeth. But she wasn't the last native speaker. She was one of the last monoglot speakers. She only spoke Cornish. But there were people who spoke it into the late 19th century. But when the revival started in the early 20th century, the first person to do this was a guy called Edward Llwyd, who was a Welshman, I think. He saw bits of Cornish in manuscripts. He was studying in Oxford. He saw bits of Cornish in medieval manuscripts, and he thought, what is this language? Do people speak it anymore? So he went to Cornwall and tried to find out. And he travelled around Cornwall and talked to people and said, does anyone speak this? And they said, no. But we remember bits of it. And there's stuff written down. There's some literature from the medieval period. There's some more modern stuff. So he kind of tried to revive Cornish based on what was left. There was no recordings at that time. So we don't know what it sounded like. So we had to kind of guess, basically. I mean, one thing, when a language dies out, it can leave traces in the language that replaces it. So in Cornwall, the way people speak English kind of reflects some aspects of Cornish. They retain some of the sounds, some of the intonation patterns, some of the vocabulary in their dialect. So you can sort of get an idea from that. So he revived Cornish. He published a book. People started to learn it. And then later on, other people came along and said, actually, what you've done there isn't very good. Let's go back to the medieval manuscripts and base it on that, because that was a purer form of Cornish. The late Cornish that you based it on was corrupted by English. It was full of English loanwords, and the grammar was changing to more English style. So people said, okay, let's go back to medieval manuscripts. And they based their revived version of Cornish on those. And they didn't know how people spoke it back then, so they had to make up a way of pronouncing it. So you had two competing versions of Cornish. Since then, many different versions have been invented. I've lost count how many there are. I think there's at least 8. And the most popular one is called Cernewek Cemin, or Common Cornish. But in 2008, all the different Cornish revival communities got together and they agreed on a standard written form for Cornish to be used in schools and on road signs. And that isn't completely standardized, because it has variants for people who prefer modern Cornish to people who prefer kind of older Cornish style. Since then, standard Cornish has been invented, but that still isn't completely accepted. So with Cornish, the problem is nobody can agree how to say anything. I have 2 friends who speak Cornish, one from Cornwall, one from Wales. They both learnt it as adults. And one learned modern Cornish, one learnt Cernewek Cemin. And they never agree how to say anything. They're always arguing. It's like, no, you don't do the verb like that. No, that word isn't spelled like that. And it's just Yeah. Yeah, they speak in Cornish. Yeah. Yeah, just about. But if you go to Cornwall, you might see Cornish on road signs, but you'd be very lucky to hear anybody speaking it. You'd have to know exactly where there'll be people who meet up in pubs and they have Cornish conversation groups. There's bands that sing songs in Cornish. They're writing new songs. There's at least one film being made in Cornish. So it's used to a limited extent. It's taught in some schools, but it's maybe about 200 people speak it as pretty fluently, and a few thousand more know a little bit. Yeah, there are a handful of people who have been raised in Cornish speaking households. I know of one, a singer called Gwenno Saunders, whose father is Cornish and her mother is Welsh. So she grew up speaking Cornish and Welsh. And she has Irish connection as well, but she didn't learn Irish. So there are a handful of native speakers, and there is recently another development is a Cornish medium kindergarten. They meet once a week, and the kids they play in Cornish, and their parents at the same time they're giving Cornish lessons, so they're encouraged to speak Cornish to their kids at home. I don't know how well this is going, but you need a lot more things like that to actually revive a language. Because one major way you can revive a language is by using it as a medium instruction. Using it as a medium of instruction in schools. Because that's one reason why, say, the Celtic languages within the UK died out. Well, diminished or died out. It's because in 1872, I think it was, there was an Education Act which made education compulsory throughout the country, but the medium of instruction was English. So until then, people may have taught in their local language, but after then, you had to teach in English. So that moved the languages out of education. So if you teach a language as a subject in a school, maybe some people will learn it. Right? I managed to learn French and German through school, but I went to France and Germany and Austria, and I was interested. I did stuff outside school, but most people in my class, they didn't learn to speak it very well. If you use the language as a medium of instruction, then people have to learn it, because they're using it as a tool to learn other things. So that's the most successful way you can revive a language with kids. If their parents are not speaking the language at school at home, you can help them in the school. But when they're outside school, as in many kids in, say, Welsh medium education, they only use Welsh in school. There are kind of organisations that encourage them to use it socially. There's kind of youth clubs and various things that encourage them to use it outside school, and they have some success. So, Cornish, it's not doing great, but it's sort of been revived, you can say. Another example, the one I particularly looked at for my my dissertation, was Manx Gaelic. This is spoken on the Isle of Man. It's an island in the middle of the Irish Sea between England and Wales and Ireland and Scotland. And Manx is a descendant of Old Irish. Before Irish settlers settled on the island, there was a language, something like Welsh, that was spoken there, we think, but we don't know anything about that. So the Irish people moved there. Then the Vikings came along, and they took over. But they don't speak a language related to Old Norse. That only had limited influence, because most of the Vikings, they married local women. And if in a family the mother speaks the local language, the kids are more likely to end up speaking that. And some of these Vikings, they'd come from Scotland and other parts where Gaelic was spoken. so they already had that background. So, so Manx, it was a language of the Isle of Man. It was spoken by everybody until probably the 18th century. In 1830, tourists started coming to the Isle of Man from England, and tourists spoke only English. So the local people thought, we got to learn English. And some people thought, yeah, our kids need to learn English to get ahead, so we have to speak English to them. We won't speak Manx anymore. So Manx, it was marginalised. The administrators, they came in because the island was administered from England. So they were English speaking. So gradually, and then the education became English, and they used English in the church. And gradually it was, the usage diminished until only a handful of people spoke it. So at the beginning of the 20th century, it died out as a community language. There was a handful of people who spoke it until about the 1980s. Officially, the last native speaker died in 1974, a guy called Ned Madrell. But when I was talking to people in the Isle of Man, they said actually there were a few native speakers into the 1980s, but they were too ashamed to admit that they spoke Manx, which tells you a lot. You know, by then, attitudes to the language weren't great. So in about the 1930s, people realized that the language was disappearing, and they started to, no, it was actually before that. It's late 19th century. The Manx Language Society was set up, and people said, right, we want to preserve this language. They didn't want to continue it as a living language. They just wanted to preserve it and say, okay, it existed. If people want to use it in the future, that's up to them, but we'll just try and preserve it. So they did that. Then later on, 1930s, people said, actually, why don't we try and revive it as a spoken language? And one person who's very prominent in the Manx language revival is a guy called Brian Stoll. And he, when he was young, he went round with a group of guys, and they were delivering groceries around the island. And they would meet the old Manx speakers, and they would talk to them, and just, you know, sit all day drinking tea and talking. So he picked up his Manx like that, and then he taught it to other people. So he was one of the first people to kind of learn it during the 20th century. So the kind of the number of people gradually increased, and then in the 1980s, they said, okay, let's try and teach kids this language. So they said, they kind of said to parents and kids, do you want to learn Manx? We can teach it in school. You don't have to. We just do it if you want. We've got a couple of people who can go around the island. It's not very big. You know, it's about 80,000 people, this island. And we can teach Manx. And so many people wanted this, they didn't have enough teachers and resources. It's so popular. If they'd said, everybody has to learn Manx, then maybe it would be a different story. But they offered it as a choice. It's something you can do. It's interesting. It's about your heritage and identity. So, you know, people learnt it. And then later on, they set up a Manx medium primary school. It's the only one in the world. It's very successful. It's very popular. Most of the kids who go there don't speak a word of Manx. After they finish, they're fluent. And then if they go on to secondary education, there's one school where they can do some subjects through Manx. So they can continue like that. And there's a few families, I know people who've grown up with Manx as their first language. And I talked to their parents. There's one, the headmistress of the school, she raised her kids speaking Manx. She wasn't a very fluent speaker. Her father, her husband is, but at the time, she wasn't very fluent. So she found it really hard, speaking nothing but Manx during the day with the kids. So she said in the evening, when the kids had gone to bed, they spoke English to each other. And now, you know, the kids still speak Manx. One of them studied in Bangor. She did French and Spanish, but she speaks Manx with her mum and her dad. I'm not sure if she speaks it with a brother and sister, but she can. So with Manx, a major advantage over Cornish was there was a translation of the Bible, which was made in 16 there. I'm not sure the exact date, but that, as with many languages, that kind of gave the model for the written language. With German you got Luther's Bible, with English you got the King James Bible. These kind of served as a model for the literature. In Cornish you don't have that. They're translating the Bible at the moment, and there's different versions, of course. But so that helped a lot. It was actually translated by a Welsh bishop, who was Bishop of the Isle of Man. And he used a kind of writing system that's nothing to do with how they write in Ireland and Scotland. If you've ever seen Irish or Scottish Gaelic, you might think, how on earth can you pronounce that? When you see the word and you hear it said, you say, what's the connection? It doesn't seem to work. There is a system. It is logical, but it's just not what you expect. For example, BH is a V sound or a W, depending on various things. And a lot of the vowels aren't pronounced because they tell you how to pronounce the consonants. So in the case of Manx, there wasn't a long tradition of writing it, so there's not a lot of literature. There's a collection of songs. There's the Bible. There's the Book of Common Prayer, and those are the main. That's the main literature from traditional Manx. So it's quite a with the Bible that's quite a lot of text. So it's quite a good model. But when it was written down, the way they wrote it, it was quite inconsistent, the spelling system. So it puts a lot of people off, because you say Irish and Scottish Gaelic, they have a consistent system. Once you've learnt it, it makes sense. With Manx, there's lots of exceptions. Letters are pronounced differently depending on the time of day, day of the week, or whatever. No, that's just a joke, but it might as well be. But it has its own orthography that's established, and that's accepted. Irish speakers and Scottish Gaelic speakers say it's ridiculous. It's not fit for the language, but Manx speakers say, yeah, that's what we got. That's what we use. So, what was I saying? With Manx literature, there's not a great deal from the traditional period, but recently people have started writing again. I have the entire canon of modern Manx literature on my bookshelf. It consists of 2 original novels and 1 collection of short stories. That's original literature written in Manx. There's been translations of various books from other languages, from English, from Irish, and from other languages, but that's all there is in original literature, really. And people write articles, they write new songs, because another kind of stream of the revival is the culture. So there's a lot of people interested in traditional Manx songs and tunes and dances, and they get into those. They may not be interested in the language at first, but maybe they'll meet other people who speak it and they say, oh, that sounds nice, can I learn that? And there's classes for adults and kids around the island, and they can learn it if they want. So that's an option. And I learnt Manx during my research. I can speak it reasonably well. I go to the Isle of Man quite regularly, and I got to know people. So as it's a very small community, I at first, when it was first revived, people said they knew everybody. They knew everybody who spoke Manx. So they saw someone, they say, okay, we can speak Manx. But now they're saying there's more and more people learning, and they don't know everybody. So that's a good sign. So according to the last census, there's about 1,800 people who speak Manx altogether. But that doesn't mean they all speak it fluently. They may know only, Moramai, which is good morning, Kistau, which is how are you, or Gudamayed, which is thank you. But if they know that, that's a start. You go to a museum or castle or some tourist thing in the Isle of Man, they will greet you. In the morning, more am I. In the afternoon, fast am I. If that's all they can say, so what? They can use it. They're happy. Maybe they'll learn more. But it's kind of coming back. It's used on signs, street signs, road signs, and stuff. And there are Manx language programs on the radio. They've made some kind of films, and so it's kind of coming back. And one reason that one kind of advantage it had over Cornish is that during the 1930s, I think, the president of Ireland, Eamon de Valera, he went to the Isle of Man, and he discovered that people still spoke Manx, and he spoke to Ned Madrill, the official last native speaker, and he was able to have a conversation with him, because Manx and Irish are very close, so they were able to understand each other. And he thought, well, where are all the other native speakers? And they said, well, there's only a handful left. So he thought, well, I should send some people and make recordings. So there's an archive of recordings of the last native speakers, which Cornish doesn't have. So that was a major advantage for Manx. So they've digitized that archive. It's available online. You can get a book with all the transcripts of those recordings. So the materials for learning Manx are actually very good. There's a site called learnmanx.com where they have courses at all levels. So if you're interested, it's there. It's available. It's easy. It's free. There's an app for iPhones and Android as well to help you learn it. So it's there. Now, okay. Last thing. Why is this relevant to us? So language revivals. It's all about rebuilding a community, a speech community. If you're learning a language, one way you can learn is to kind of try and create a virtual community, a virtual speech community through Skype, through meeting people face to face, through virtual worlds, as we saw earlier, if you were there. So revival efforts show that the importance of a community. You can't do it on your own. You need other people to speak with. And immersion education is important. So immersion in a language is a very good way to learn it. If you find yourself in a situation where you have to speak it, when nobody will speak to you in your native language, then you will find ways to communicate. It may not be perfect, but over time, you will get there. Culture is a very important part. If you're learning a language because you think, a lot of people these days are learning Chinese because they think China is a big economy, we should learn it, I can get a job. That's not enough. You need to be engaged with the culture of a language to keep up your motivation. If you say, okay, I really like Chinese cinema, I want to learn about the films and how they're made and what they mean and that thing, that can help you motivate you. And you can learn a lot from that, or Chinese food, or Italian opera, or Irish songs, or whatever. You can find something within a language that fascinates you, and that can motivate you, and you can, and through that, like, for example, I learned Irish myself. I've been going to Ireland every year for the past 10 years, and what I do there, I go to summer schools, and they teach Irish in the morning, and I do singing classes in the afternoon. You see, we learn traditional Irish songs. And I actually got into the language through those songs. I started listening to them when I was at school. I was fascinated. I loved the sound of the language. I thought, maybe one day I'll learn it, but first I'll learn the songs. So I learnt the songs. I didn't know what they meant. But over time, I kind of thought, yeah, maybe I'll learn it. So I did. So, if you get into a language like that, it's a very powerful way to do it. So, ways to motivate people. Okay, so in language revival situations, it can be difficult to say to people, okay, you speak a world language, and now we want you to learn this minority language only a handful of people speak. Say, why should I do that? What's in it for me? So you have to find ways to encourage people to do it. You say, okay, it's got an interesting culture. You can find out about your heritage, your identity, because identity is a great part of this. My mother, for example, is Welsh. She grew up in England. She doesn't speak a word of Welsh. She's tried to learn it, but hasn't. My father was English, so our home language was English. I didn't learn Welsh until I was about 28, I think. So I learned Welsh because I'd always been interested in it. It was my heritage language, but nobody in the family had spoken it for a long time. So for me, it was part of my identity. Okay, I've said enough now. I was going to try and have more questions, but okay. So, do we have any questions? Yeah.
You talked about revival and also about saving a language before it dies.
Yeah.
And of course, revival has the advantage that the language will be spoken.
Yeah.
But with revival, I imagine that most of the knowledge which was carried by the language is lost. So we speak the language,
Yeah.
but we don't know anymore what were the specific knowledge, often bound to an environment which
Yeah.
had disappeared.
Yeah.
In recording the language, we can hope that they are also recording some of the knowledge.
Yeah.
So my question is, do you know if UNESCO or any enterprise or any is trying to save some of the endangered language? Is there an official program, just
Yes.
like they do for seeds?
Yeah. These are some of the organisations that are trying to save languages.
Okay.
Can you just comment on what Google is doing at the moment to preserve the languages? They have a project to record like last speakers of some extinct languages.
Yeah.
Do you know about that project?
I don't know a lot about that project, but it sounds like it's a good idea.
Because
Yeah.
they created some kind of environment and they record people speaking the language and they ask questions, how do you say this in your language, how do you say
Yeah.
that, and they record people who might be the last speakers of
Yeah.
this language.
I mean, that's not enough really to fully document the language, but it gives you an idea, something to preserve something of the language.
Could you also comment on the situation with Irish language in Ireland? Because I'm from Ireland, but I'm Russian.
Yeah.
But my children learn Irish at school,
Yeah.
but they hate it.
Yeah.
And all Irish kids, as far as I know,
Yeah. That's very
Irish
common. Yeah.
because it's compulsory and they don't
Yeah.
like the language, so they try and stay away from it.
Yeah.
And they actually bully people who are interested in Irish. They would say, "Oh, you learn."
Yeah. Yeah. That's a problem. I mean, yeah, people I know in Ireland, they say they have similar experiences. They hated Irish in school. They had no intention of speaking it, but later in life, they got interested in it again. They go to dance classes to do traditional Irish dance, and they think, well, maybe I'll learn the language as well. So it can come back, but I think it's partly the way it's taught. I think it has changed a bit recently, but it's often focused on this is the verb to be. You have to learn this, and this is how you make a sentence, and it's boring basically. It's not about this is how you say, you know, do you want to go for a drink? What's going on?
Exactly. Then they say, "Oh, I speak Irish." I say, "Okay, tell me how to say I want an ice cream."
Yeah, they
I
don't.
never get an answer. I'm waiting for 3 years now. No ice cream.
Away them up to Russia. That's how you say I'd like an ice cream. Okay.
No, they know how to say it in Esperanto, but
Yeah.
they don't know how to say it.
Away them up to Russia. Yeah.
As Magne Franchon said, when the language dies out, most of the knowledge disappears.
Yeah.
You talk about revival, and this notion of revival, I think, is more of a cultural notion. So this revival serves an important role in strengthening a cultural and ethnic identity. Linguistically, it is not revival. Linguistically, it is the creation of a totally new language that may have some connection with some ancient languages. But I mean, I can take the example of Hebrew, which I know very well. had significantly different dialects. No one was a native speaker, so those who spoke Hebrew, they spoke more the native languages with Hebrew words.
Yeah.
And what you get today in modern Hebrew is actually some sort of a creolized language. With Semitic vocabulary, with Semitic morphology, but totally European mindset.
Yeah.
It's not really a revived Hebrew. It's a
Yeah,
language.
well-
It's Esperanto with Hebrew.
Well, yes. Well, yeah, that happens. If it's not possible to carry on in the traditional language, then you have to try and reinvent it. That's what happened to English. After the Norman invasion, English disappeared from high-level society because the language of peasants. It changed. When people started speaking English again 200 or 300 years later, it was partly creolized. You know, it had absorbed lots of French, grammar had been simplified, so it became Middle English. So you could say that's a problem. You're not speaking the old language anymore, but languages change all the time. So, you know, some people say there's no point in speaking a revived language, it's not the same language as before, but you know, languages change, so we could say, no, it's not a problem. We have this language and we want to speak it, so
Yeah. Maybe my point is that we ought to think of language revival in terms of a cultural notion and not a linguistic notion.
well, yeah, maybe, yeah. It's partly reconstruction, it's partly, yeah, rebuilding culture, yeah.
I'm curious, you mentioned some successful or somewhat
Yeah.
successful language revivals or attempts, but I'm sure there have been many attempts that were unsuccessful. Do you have something you can share from your experience researching this that's like an essential factor that's needed for it to be successful?
I think you need community support. If the community has decided they don't want the language anymore, then it's very difficult to revive it.
The speakers themselves.
The speakers themselves, yeah. Because, like Native American languages, some communities, they're very keen to revive and revitalize their languages. Others have decided, no, it's in the past, we don't want it anymore. And if linguists come in from outside and say, yeah, we want to try and get people to speak this language, and the community don't support that, it's not going to work.
Just to make a comment, if you're interested in language revitalization and documentation, apart from looking up these links, do come to SOAS School of Oriental and African Studies in London, that does a master's program that I'm on, on language documentation. And if you want to talk about it more, you can also talk to me. We work with Hans Rosling Endangered Languages project, and we also host an Endangered Languages archive, which is available online. So, you know, if you have a heritage language that you're learning or something that you want to know how to just you can also the archive or study this topic in detail. And go on with your work, because I intend to.
Okay, I think we have to finish there.